Nobody was supposed to go in there. That was the rule. Unspoken, unwritten, but understood by every member of staff at Clarence House the way you understand not to touch a bruise. You see it. You walk around it. You don't ask why. The room at the end of the East Corridor had been locked since September. Since Margaret Hollis had worked royal household for 19 years. She'd polished silver that hadn't been used since a state dinner in 2003. She'd ironed tablecloths so large they required 2 people and a prayer. She'd learned, over nearly 2 decades, that palaces are not made of stone. They're made of silence. Layers of it, pressed down like geological strata, centuries thick. She was not supposed to be in that corridor. She was supposed to be in the linen room on the 2nd floor, cataloging, inventory day, clipboard, the particular boredom of counting pillowcases. But the inventory list had sent her to retrieve a cross-reference item, and the cross-reference was, inexplicably, filed in the East Corridor storage cabinet. And she had her key ring, and she was tired, and she just needed the file. She wasn't snooping. She needed to believe that. The corridor smelled different this far east. Older. Like the air itself hadn't circulated since someone last opened those windows with intention. Windows opened for her, for the person who had decided which rooms got aired and which didn't, for 70 years of preference and habit that no one had yet learned to undo. Margaret found the storage cabinet, found the file, stood for a moment in the quiet. That's when she heard it. Or rather, didn't hear it. The absence of sound from behind the locked door had a texture to it that she couldn't explain to the 2 officers later when they asked her to describe what made her stop. What made her press her hand flat against the wood. Warmth. The door was warm. Not radiator warm. Not the conducted warmth of a heated building. Something else. Something like the warmth a room holds when a person has recently been inside it. She stepped back. She told herself she'd imagined it. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard. She heard. She wasn't imagining. She heard it. The sound of a hanger. Metal against metal. The precise acoustic signature of a wardrobe being closed. She stopped walking. Her clipboard hung at her side. 19 years of palace-trained deference warred with something older, something that lived below all the training in the animal part of her that recognized wrong the way her body recognized cold. She turned around. She walked back. She stood outside the door, and she knocked. Nothing. She tried her key ring out of instinct, not expecting any of her keys to fit. They never fit rooms above her clearance level. And the second key she tried, a key she'd never used, a key she couldn't remember being issued, turned in the lock with a click so clean it felt like the room had been waiting for her. The smell hit her first. Old fabric. Preservation chemicals. The particular museum air of something clothed in careful protection. And, beneath that, something floral. Jasmine, maybe, or the ghost of it. The memory of scent leaves in a room when the person who wore it hasn't walked through in months. She reached for the light switch. The room was not a storage room. It had been made into one. Partially, imperfectly, as though someone had begun converting it with great intention and then stopped. Dress forms stood along one wall, 3 of them, draped in protective cloth. Hat boxes were stacked with a precision that suggested someone knew exactly what was in each one. A chaise longue sat in the corner, its upholstery worn in the specific way furniture wears when one person uses one spot consistently, for years. Margaret stood in the doorway and did not step inside. She was looking at the wardrobe. Mahogany. Old. Not a piece that belonged to the house's current aesthetic. It belonged to another era, another residence, possibly another country. Its doors weren't fully closed. One was open perhaps 3 inches, and through that gap hung something that caught the light in a way that made her breath go shallow. Gold thread. White silk. The unmistakable weight of embroidery, so fine it looked like it had been done by people who'd ruined their eyesight doing it. She knew that fabric. She'd seen it in photographs. In retrospectives. On the covers of commemorative issues she'd thumbed through in the staff room during her tea breaks. Every British person who'd been alive in 1953 had seen it. And everyone born after had seen the photographs enough times that recognition was cellular. She took out her phone. Her hands were not steady. She called the head of household security. She did not go inside. She did not touch anything. She stood in the doorway of the warm room with the jasmine ghost, and the open wardrobe, and she waited. And while she waited, she looked at the 3 inches of silk and gold thread, and she felt something she couldn't name. Not quite grief, not quite outrage, something that lived between them in the territory of this is not right, and I don't know what to do with that. The security team arrived in 11 minutes. 11 minutes is a long time to stand still in a doorway. She spent them trying to remember the exact key she'd used, and failing. She spent them looking at that silk. She spent them not thinking about what it meant that the door had been warm. The lead officer, Thomas Collins, 22 years service, the kind of man whose face gave nothing, stepped past her, looked at the wardrobe, looked at the dress forms, looked at the hat boxes, and then, very quietly said something into his radio that she couldn't hear. He turned to her. "Mrs. Hollis, when did you last have occasion to be in this corridor?" "Never," she said. "Linen and soft furnishings." He nodded, wrote something down. "And the key you used, I can't find it." She'd checked 3 times. Her key ring had the same keys it always had. Nothing extra, nothing missing. The key she'd used was gone as though it had never been there. And she understood, in a way that settled in her stomach like cold water, that this was a thing she was going to have to explain to multiple people in escalating levels of seniority, and none of them were going to find her explanation satisfying, because she didn't find it satisfying herself. Collins turned back to the wardrobe. He opened it fully, carefully, with gloved hands that someone had appeared from somewhere and given to him. The gown unfolded into the light. Margaret pressed her hand over her mouth. She'd seen photographs. She thought she'd known what it looked like. She hadn't known. No photograph had ever captured what it did to the air around it. The way it seemed to generate its own gravity, pulling the eye to it the way significant things pull. The way you can feel a famous painting before you see it. That specific cultural weight the human nervous system registers before the brain catches up. 8,000 pearls. She'd read that number in a commemorative issue. She'd thought she understood it. She had not understood it. Collins was very still. The other officer, young, new, Margaret didn't know his name, made a sound she couldn't categorize, something that wasn't quite a word, that lived in the register below speech. Nobody moved for a moment. Then, Collins reached for his radio again, and this time Margaret heard exactly what he said. "We need to escalate this. Now." The call went up the chain in under an hour. By nightfall, there were 12 people in a room they were pretending wasn't a crisis meeting. Senior household officials, 2 palace lawyers, a woman from the Lord Chamberlain's office whose title was long enough that no one used it, just her surname, Ashworth, delivered with the particular brevity reserved for people whose competence needs no decorating. Margaret Hollis sat in a chair outside the room with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She'd given her statement twice. She would give it twice more before the night was done. Each time, she told exactly the same story, because it was the only story she had, and the only part that changed was the face of the person writing it down, and the careful way they tried not to look alarmed. They were all alarmed. Inside the room, no one said Camilla's name directly for the first 40 minutes. They used phrases. The current occupant, the household principal, Her Majesty, said with the particular caution of people navigating a minefield in dress shoes. Every step measured, weight distributed evenly, trying not to make a sound that carried. Ashworth was the one who finally said it. "This wardrobe is in Her Majesty's private annex." That is a factual statement. I'd like to move past our collective discomfort with its implications and get to the question of provenance. Silence. "The gown," she continued, "was listed as transferred to the Royal Collection in November. The collection has a record of receipt. Signed. Verified. The gown currently sitting in a wardrobe in the East Corridor Annex cannot, therefore, be the gown transferred to the collection. Which means either the collection's record is in error," she paused, "or there are 2 gowns." The room made no sound. The room was very good at making no sound. These were people professionally trained in absorbing information without visible reaction, and this was the hardest they'd ever worked at it. "The collection record," said the palace lawyer on the left, "was processed under the estate transition protocols. The authentication was, I know what it was," Ashworth said, not unkindly, with the precision of someone ending an avenue of conversation. "I processed it." Another silence. This one different. Fuller. What they didn't say in that room, what no one would say for several more days, not in writing, not in any document with a distribution list, was what had been understood in the East Corridor the moment Collins opened the wardrobe fully. The gown had not been stored. It had been kept. There is a difference, and it lives in the details. A stored gown is wrapped in acid-free tissue, sealed in climate-controlled darkness, tagged, numbered, divorced from the person who wore it. A kept gown is hung where air can reach it. A kept gown has been, recently, touched. The protective sheath over it was not sealed. It was draped, loosely, the way you drape a cover over something you intend to return to. The hanger it hung from was cedar. Personal, not institutional. Someone had been visiting it. That was the word that came to Margaret, sitting outside with her cold tea, when she let herself think past the training and the procedure, and the careful containment of her own reaction. Visiting. Like a grave you return to because the grief hasn't finished with you yet. Like a chair you still sit in because you can't bring yourself to reupholster it. Like keeping the voicemail. She thought about the warmth of the door. She thought about the metal-on-metal sound of a hanger. She was not a person who leapt to conclusions. 19 years of palace work had sanded that instinct down to nearly nothing. But she sat with her cold tea and she thought about a woman who had waited for decades, through other marriages, through public cruelty, through the kind of sustained, institutionalized rejection that would have broken most people clean through, who had waited and then, finally, stood in a church and been crowned. And she thought that grief was not a simple thing. And love was not a simple thing. And sometimes the line between possession and devotion was thinner than anyone was comfortable admitting. She wasn't excusing anything. She didn't know what there was to excuse. She didn't know enough. She knew a door had been warmed and a hanger had moved and a gown that was supposed to be in the collection was instead hanging in cedar-scented darkness with its cover loosely draped. Visited. That was all she knew. It felt like enough. The authentication team arrived from the collection at 9 the next morning. 3 people. Cases of equipment. The particular focused stillness of experts about to do the thing they've spent careers preparing for, radiantly calm on the surface, absolutely alive underneath. Margaret was not there for this part. She'd been sent home the previous evening with a formal acknowledgement of her assistance, a reminder of her confidentiality obligations, and a car. The car had felt like both a kindness and a signal. She heard about the authentication through Collins, 3 weeks later, in the way information leaked in palaces, not in words, but in the quality of a silence when you asked a question, in the way he didn't correct her when she said the wrong thing, in the small, controlled permission of a look that meant yes, you have the shape of it right. The gown was real. The collection's gown was also real. The answer to how this was possible was buried somewhere in the handoff documentation from 1953, in the correspondence between a young queen's household and the Norman Hartnell atelier, in letters that had been preserved not because anyone thought they'd matter but because that era preserved everything, reflexively, the way you save a receipt you'll never look at again until suddenly, you need it for exactly this. There had been 2 dresses made. One for the ceremony. One for the possibility that the ceremony went wrong, weather, accident, damage, the kind of contingency planning that surrounds a coronation the way scaffolding surrounds a cathedral. When nothing went wrong, the second dress had been quietly set aside, its existence neither announced nor denied, folded into the margins of history the way contingencies are when they're never needed. Where it had been for the decades between then and now was not something Margaret ever learned. What she understood, what she let herself understand, sitting in her kitchen with her morning tea the way she liked it, the knowledge settling into her slowly over the weeks that followed, was that somewhere in the distance between the crown and the woman who wears it there was always a person, navigating, carrying, choosing, every day, what to hold on to and what to let go. Some things were harder to let go than others. Some rooms stayed warm even when they were empty. She drank her tea. She thought about 8,000 pearls catching the light. She didn't tell anyone. 6 weeks after the wardrobe, Margaret received a letter. Not an email. A letter. Cream-colored paper, heavy enough that the envelope had its own presence, the kind of stationery that communicates before you've read a word. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize, controlled, learned, the penmanship of someone taught by people who believed penmanship was a moral category. There was no return address. She opened it at her kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her second cup of tea cooling beside her. She read it once. Then, she set it down and looked out the window at her neighbor's fence for a while. Then, she read it again. It was 7 sentences long. It thanked her for her discretion. It acknowledged, without explaining or elaborating, that she had conducted herself with extraordinary professionalism. It noted, this was the sentence she returned to, the one she read 4, 5, 6 times, that there are aspects of royal life that resist easy categorization, and that the people who serve closest to those aspects bear a weight that is rarely acknowledged publicly. The 7th sentence was, the gown has been returned to where it belongs. It was only ever visiting. No signature. None was needed. Margaret folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, placed it in the tin she kept in the back of her wardrobe, behind the summer dresses she wore twice a year, next to the photograph of her mother and the service medal her father had never framed. Things you keep. Not for anyone else. For yourself. The story leaked, as these things do, 6 months later. Not from Margaret. Not from Collins. Not as far as anyone could trace, from anyone who'd been in that corridor or that room. Palaces are permeable, centuries of servants and officials and visiting dignitaries and their attendants had established 1,000 channels of information, and something always escaped eventually, shaped and reshaped by each set of hands it passed through until it barely resembled its origin. What leaked was not the truth exactly. It was the truth's silhouette. A gown. A private room. A discovery. The tabloids did what tabloids do. The word hidden appeared in every headline. As though keeping something in your own home was concealment. As though private grief was the same as theft. Hidden. Margaret read the headlines on her phone on the bus to work and felt something clench in her chest. Not quite anger. Something quieter and older than anger. Something more like the feeling you get when someone tells a story at a party and gets the most important detail wrong, and you can't correct them because correcting them would reveal more than you're allowed to reveal. She put her phone away. She looked at the bus window. Her own reflection sat transparent over the passing street. What the headlines missed, what they couldn't know, because the people who knew weren't talking, was the part that had stayed with Margaret through all 6 weeks and all the months after. Not the gown itself, not the discovery, not even the letter. The warmth of the door. She'd pressed her hand flat against that wood and felt something that her 19 years of palace training had no file for, no protocol to manage. She'd stood in a locked corridor with a key that disappeared and felt, through 6 inches of mahogany, the residue of a person who had stood on the other side of it. Not recently. Not in the hour before. Not warming the door with some detectable body heat in the way a radiator warms. Something else. The warmth a room holds when it's been loved in. When someone has returned to it the way you return to things you can't put down, not compulsively, not obsessively, just humanly. The warmth of being chosen again and again by someone who had other choices. She'd spent her career in the periphery of a specific kind of power, the kind measured in acres and centuries and objects so weighted with history that touching them felt like a statement. She'd cataloged it, polished it, carried it from room to room in white cotton gloves. She'd been close to it every day without ever quite touching it, which was, she understood, the job. The whole job. But, standing in that doorway, she'd touched something that wasn't power. Something smaller. More difficult. A woman who had finally, arrived somewhere she'd been trying to reach for most of her adult life. And who was still, quietly, privately, in a locked room at the end of an east corridor, sitting with the distance between where she'd arrived and who she'd been waiting to arrive with. The gown had not belonged to Camilla. It had belonged to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was gone. And the crown was on a different head now. And the scepter was in different hands. And the orb and the ring and the centuries of carefully passed down objects had moved along the way they always did, because that was the whole design. Nothing stops. Nothing rests. The institution swallows everything and keeps going. But grief doesn't get the memo. Grief shows up in east corridors in the middle of inventory days and presses its hand against warm wood and refuses to be categorized. Margaret retired the following spring. 19 years, then 20. Enough. Her leaving gift was a framed photograph of the household staff and a card signed by more people than she'd have guessed remembered her name. She cried in the staff room in a way that embarrassed her and touched her in equal measure, because she'd always been better at caring for things than at letting people see it. She planted a garden that summer. Roses, which she'd always wanted and never had room for in the apartment. She got her knees dirty. She learned that the difference between a plant that survives and a plant that thrives is almost never water or sunlight. It's attention. The particular quality of noticing a thing every day and responding to what you find. She thought sometimes about the letter in the tin. It was only ever visiting. She thought about how you could say that about almost anything that mattered. The people you love. The versions of yourself you became and then outgrew. The grief that moves in and rearranges the furniture and then, slowly, doesn't leave but learns to live quietly in the rooms you stop locking. She didn't think it diminished anything. A gown that was only ever visiting was still a gown someone chose to keep. A room you return to is still a room that matters. Some warmth doesn't go away just because the source of it does. She pressed her hands into the dirt around the roses, and the afternoon light came through the garden the way light does in early June, young and gold and entirely indifferent to the weight of the things it lands on. And she stayed there long enough that her knees ached, and it was fine, and the roses were going to be fine, and some doors stay warm longer than anyone expects. She had learned that. She kept it. And,